The rain hammered against my apartment windows like an accusation, each drop echoing the rhythm of my restless heart as I tried to focus on the book in my lap. At 11:47 p.m., I wasn't expecting visitors. Hell, I wasn't expecting anyone to be awake except insomniacs and night shift workers. So when 3 sharp knocks cut through the storm's white noise, my pulse jumped in that particular way it does when the universe decides to upend your carefully constructed evening routine. I padded to the door in my worn pajama pants and oversized college sweatshirt, the same Northwestern hoodie I'd been wearing since Marcus and I graduated 4 years ago. The peephole revealed a figure hunched against the hallway's harsh fluorescent lighting, soaked to the bone with a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Even distorted by the fisheye lens, I'd recognize that silhouette anywhere. The broad shoulders I'd memorized during countless study sessions, the way he always shifted his weight to his left foot when he was nervous. Marcus. I pulled the door open, and my best friend since sophomore year looked up at me with eyes that held a particular brand of devastation I'd only seen once before, the night his father had his heart attack junior year. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and his usual confident posture had crumbled into something smaller, more fragile. Jesus, what happened? Are you okay? He attempted a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, the kind of expression that fooled exactly nobody. Hey, Chris. I know it's late, and I'm sorry for just showing up like this, but his voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat, looking down at his soaked sneakers. Could I maybe crash here tonight? I'll explain everything, I promise, but I didn't know where else to go. Comment where you're listening from. Without hesitation, I stepped aside and gestured him into my small but cozy living room. Of course, man. Always. You know that. The relief that flooded his features made my chest tighten in that familiar way, the same ache I'd been carrying for years, the one that reminded me daily that my feelings for Marcus ran deeper than friendship, deeper than anything I'd ever been brave enough to voice. Let me grab you a towel. You're dripping all over my hardwood floors. As I rummaged through my linen closet, I could hear him setting down his bag with the kind of careful quiet that suggested he was trying not to disturb anything, not to take up more space than absolutely necessary. When I returned with the fluffiest towel I owned, he was standing in the middle of my living room looking lost, like he couldn't quite believe he was there. Thank you, he said, accepting the towel and running it through his hair. I know this is weird, showing up in the middle of the night like some kind of refugee. You're not weird, and you're not a refugee, I said, settling onto my couch and patting the cushion beside me. You're my best friend, and something's obviously wrong. Talk to me. Marcus sank onto the couch with a heavy sigh, leaving just enough space between us that I could feel the careful distance he was maintaining. He stared at his hands for a long moment, and I watched the play of emotions across his face, embarrassment, frustration, something that might have been shame. Madison and I broke up, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 days ago. It was bad, Chris. Really bad. She said things, I said things, and by the end of it, we were both just trying to hurt each other as much as possible. He laughed bitterly. Mission accomplished, I guess. I felt that familiar stab of protectiveness mixed with something more complicated. Relief that he was no longer with Madison, guilt about feeling relieved, and concern for the obvious pain he was carrying. I'm sorry, Marcus. I know you guys were together for almost 2 years. That's huge. Yeah, well, apparently 2 years wasn't enough for her to think twice about telling Jake everything she thought was wrong with me, he continued, his jaw tightening. And Jake, being the stand-up guy he is, decided I needed to find somewhere else to live. Tonight, in the middle of a thunderstorm. He gestured vaguely toward the window, where the rain was still painting abstract patterns on the glass. He kicked you out? The anger in my voice surprised both of us. Tonight? In this weather? Marcus shrugged, but I could see the hurt he was trying to hide. He's Madison's brother. Blood is thicker than water, right? Plus, I think he was looking for an excuse anyway. We never really got along that well. I wanted to reach out, to touch his shoulder or his hand, to offer some kind of physical comfort the way friends do. But with Marcus, I learned to be careful about casual contact, learned to maintain boundaries that protected both of us from the truth of what I felt for him. Instead, I leaned forward slightly, making sure he could see the sincerity in my eyes. You can stay here as long as you need, I said. I mean it. The couch is actually pretty comfortable. I've fallen asleep on it more times than I care to admit during Netflix binges. And it's not like I'm using the space for anything else. The gratitude that washed over his features was almost overwhelming. Chris, I can't ask you to. You're not asking, I interrupted. I'm offering. There's a difference. I stood up, already mentally rearranging my routine to accommodate his presence. Are you hungry? I think I have some leftover pizza in the fridge, and I can make coffee if you want to talk more. I don't deserve a friend like you, he said quietly, and something in his tone made my heart skip. There was a vulnerability there that I'd rarely heard from him, a rawness that made me want to pull him into my arms and tell him everything would be okay. Instead, I headed toward the kitchen, calling over my shoulder, "Lucky for you. Friendship isn't about deserving. It's about showing up." I paused in the doorway, looking back at him sitting on my couch, his damp hair catching the lamplight. "And you've always shown up for me, Marcus. Always." As I reheated pizza and started a pot of coffee, I tried to ignore the way my hands were shaking slightly, the way my pulse had been elevated since the moment I'd opened the door. Having Marcus here, in my space, needing me, it was everything I'd ever wanted and everything I'd been afraid to hope for. The familiar ache of unrequited love settled in my chest like an old friend, and I wondered how I was going to survive having him this close, this vulnerable, this beautifully human in my carefully constructed sanctuary. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Marcus moving around my kitchen. For a moment, I lay there listening, struck by how natural it felt to have another person in my space. I'd lived alone for 3 years, carefully cultivating my solitude, but Marcus's presence didn't feel intrusive. It felt like coming home to something I hadn't realized I'd been missing. When I emerged from my bedroom, I found Marcus standing at my kitchen counter in yesterday's clothes, scrolling through his phone with a steaming mug beside him. His hair was disheveled, sticking up at odd angles, and there was something vulnerable about seeing him in the morning light that made my chest tight. "Morning," he said without looking up, his voice still rough with sleep. "Hope you don't mind I made coffee. I couldn't figure out how to work your fancy machine, so I just used the regular pot." "It's fine," I said, pouring myself a cup. "Sleep okay?" He shrugged, finally meeting my eyes. "Better than I thought I would. Your couch is way more comfortable than it looks." He paused, something flickering across his face. "Thanks again, Chris, for all of this. I know it's not exactly what you signed up for when we became friends." The casual way he said it, like his presence here was somehow a burden rather than the answer to years of secret longing, made something twist in my stomach. "Don't be ridiculous," I said, probably too quickly. "That's what friends do." Friends. The word felt hollow in my mouth, but Marcus smiled, and I reminded myself that friendship with him was better than nothing at all. Over the next few days, we settled into an unexpected routine. Marcus would wake up early and job hunt from my kitchen table while I got ready for work, and I'd come home to find him either still at his laptop or sprawled on my couch, looking defeated. He'd applied to dozens of places, had a few phone interviews, but nothing solid yet. His apartment search was going even worse. Everything decent was either too expensive or had a waiting list. "I might have to look at places further out," he said on Thursday night, not looking up from his laptop. "I can't keep camping on your couch forever." The thought of him moving across town, of seeing him even less than I had before, made my chest constrict. "You're not camping," I said. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need." He looked up then, studying my face with an intensity that made me nervous. "You sure? I know you value your space. Remember junior year when you wouldn't even let me keep a toothbrush here?" I remembered. I'd been so terrified of wanting more, of reading too much into every casual touch and sleepy morning moment, that I'd maintained strict boundaries. No overnight stays, no personal items, no blurring of lines that might reveal too much of what I felt. That was different, I said, which was both true and completely inadequate. "How?" The question hung in the air between us, and I scrambled for an answer that wouldn't reveal everything. We were younger. I was still figuring out how to be a good friend. Something shifted in his expression, but before I could analyze it, he closed his laptop and stretched. Movie night. Our movie nights had become a ritual. Marcus would claim the couch, I'd take the chair, and we'd argue good-naturedly about what to watch before settling on something we'd both seen a dozen times. But tonight, when I headed for my usual spot, Marcus patted the cushion beside him. "Come on, don't sit all the way over there. I'm not contagious." My heart did something complicated in my chest. but I sat down, careful to maintain space between us. We'd settled on an old action movie, something mindless and familiar, but I found myself more aware of Marcus beside me than anything happening on screen. He'd changed into a t-shirt and sweatpants, clothes I'd lent him that fit surprisingly well, and every time he shifted or reached for his water, I caught hints of his cologne mixed with my laundry detergent. Halfway through the movie, during a particularly ridiculous chase scene, Marcus laughed and let his hand fall on my shoulder. "Remember when we tried to recreate this scene with your car in college?" I remembered. We'd been drunk on cheap beer and young stupidity, and Marcus had insisted we could definitely pull off a handbrake turn in a parking lot. We'd ended up spinning out into a snowbank, laughing so hard we could barely breathe. "We're lucky we didn't kill ourselves," I said, acutely aware that his hand was still on my shoulder, his thumb absently tracing small circles against my shirt. "Worth it, though," he said, and when I looked at him, his eyes were soft with the memory. "Some of the best times of my life were just stupid shit like that with you." The sincerity in his voice made my breath catch. We were sitting closer than we had in years, his hand warm and solid on my shoulder, and for a moment I let myself imagine what it would be like if this meant what I wanted it to mean. But then the movie exploded back into action, and Marcus turned back to the screen, though his hand stayed where it was until the credits rolled. By Friday, the casual touches had multiplied. Marcus would brush past me in the kitchen, his hand briefly touching my lower back. He'd lean over my shoulder to look at something on my phone, close enough that I could feel his breath on my neck. During our movie that night, he gradually migrated from his end of the couch until he was close enough that our thighs were touching. Each touch sent electricity through my system, and I found myself hyperanalyzing every interaction, looking for signs that meant something more than friendship. But Marcus had always been tactile, had always been comfortable with casual contact. The fact that it was driving me slowly insane didn't mean it meant anything to him. Saturday morning, I woke to find Marcus already up, sitting at my kitchen table with his laptop and a cup of coffee. But instead of the focused job-hunting energy of the past few days, he looked contemplative, almost melancholy. "Everything okay?" I asked, settling into the chair across from him. He looked up, and there was something in his eyes I couldn't quite read. "Can I ask you something?" My pulse quickened. "Sure. How do you do it? Love alone, I mean. Be completely independent like this." He gestured vaguely at my apartment. "I've been thinking about it all week, watching you, and you just seem so settled. Content with your own company." It was such a loaded question, coming from him. How could I explain that I'd built my solitude as a fortress against wanting things I couldn't have? That my carefully constructed independence was really just elaborate self-protection? "I don't know," I said finally. "I guess I've always been comfortable with quiet. But don't you get lonely?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Of course I got lonely. I'd been lonely for years, surrounded by friends and colleagues, but aching for something deeper, something real. And the worst part was that the person I wanted most had been right there the whole time, completely out of reach. Sometimes, I admitted, which was perhaps the most honest I'd ever been with him about anything. Marcus nodded slowly, like my answer confirmed something he'd been thinking. "I always thought I needed noise, you know? People around, constant stimulation. But this week, just being here with you, it's been peaceful, different than I expected." There was something in his voice, a quality I couldn't quite identify, that made my stomach flutter with dangerous hope. Different how? But before he could answer, his phone rang, and the moment fractured. It was a potential employer, wanting to set up an interview for Monday, and by the time he hung up, the conversational thread had been lost. That night, we fell into our usual movie routine, but the energy between us felt different. Charged. Marcus sat closer than ever, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, and when he laughed at something on screen, he turned to share the moment with me, his face inches from mine. "You have really good taste in movies," he said, his voice quieter than necessary. "We've been friends for 8 years, I replied. "You know my taste in movies." "Yeah, but I'm seeing it differently now." "Seeing you differently, I guess." The words hung between us, loaded with possibility and danger. I wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to push for clarity, but I was terrified of the answer. What if I was reading too much into everything? What if my desperation was making me see things that weren't there? Instead, I turned back to the movie, hyper-aware of every point where our bodies were almost touching, every breath, every small movement. Marcus settled back against the couch cushions, and gradually, inevitably, the space between us disappeared entirely. His shoulder pressed against mine, solid and warm, and when I didn't pull away, he seemed to relax into the contact. By the time the credits rolled, we were sitting pressed together from shoulder to knee, the pretense of casual friendship stretched thin. Marcus made no move to create distance, and neither did I. We sat there in the flickering light of the TV, not speaking, and I wondered if he could hear my heart hammering in my chest. "I should probably let you get some sleep," Marcus said eventually, but he didn't move. "Probably," I agreed, also not moving. Another few minutes passed in charged silence before Marcus finally shifted, the loss of contact making me feel suddenly cold. But as he stood, he let his hand trail across my shoulder, his fingers lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. "Good night, Chris," he said, and there was something in his voice that made my name sound different in his mouth. "Good night," I managed, watching him gather his things and disappear into the living room. I lay awake for hours that night, replaying every moment, every touch, every loaded glance. Marcus was just feet away, probably already asleep on my couch, and I found myself straining to hear any sound from the living room. Part of me wanted to get up, to find some excuse to check on him, but I didn't trust myself to maintain appropriate boundaries if I found him still awake. Something was shifting between us. I was almost certain of it. The way he looked at me, the way he'd been touching me, the questions about loneliness and contentment, it felt like he was testing boundaries, exploring possibilities. But I'd been wrong about these things before, had read too much into moments that meant nothing, and I couldn't afford to be wrong about this. The stakes were too high. If I was misreading the situation, if I pushed too hard or revealed too much, I could lose him entirely. And as much as it hurt to love him from a distance, it would be devastating to lose him completely. But as I finally drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were approaching some kind of precipice, that the careful balance we'd maintained for 8 years was about to shift in ways neither of us could predict or control. The precipice I'd since proved prophetic. By Thursday morning of our first week together, something fundamental had shifted in the way Marcus moved through my space, through our shared routines, through the careful choreography we'd perfected over 8 years of friendship. I noticed it first in the kitchen. Marcus had always been comfortable in my apartment, but now he lingered in doorways when I passed, his presence somehow more intentional, more weighted. When I reached around him for the coffee mugs, he didn't step aside the way he used to. Instead, he stayed put, letting me brush against his back, his shoulder, the solid warmth of his chest. These moments stretched longer than they should have, filled with a tension that made my breath catch. "Sorry," I'd mutter, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. "Don't be," Marcus would reply, his voice carrying an undertone I couldn't quite decipher. The couch situation had evolved too. What started as Marcus claiming the far end had gradually become him sitting in the middle, then somehow migrating until there was barely a cushion's width between us. By Friday night, as we settled in for our usual movie marathon, Marcus dropped down next to me close enough that our thighs touched. "This okay?" he asked, glancing at me with an expression that seemed to hold more questions than the simple one he'd voiced. Of course, I managed, though my heart was hammering so hard I was certain he could hear it. Marcus smiled, a slow, almost shy curve of his lips that I'd never seen before. "Good." The movie, some action thriller I'd suggested, played on the screen, but I couldn't have recounted the plot to save my life. Every cell in my body was focused on the points where Marcus's body touched mine, his thigh pressed against mine, his shoulder bumping against me when he laughed, the way he'd started resting his arm along the back of the couch so his fingers occasionally brushed my neck. Halfway through the film, Marcus shifted, turning slightly toward me. "Christopher." "Yeah. Thanks. For all this. I know it's not easy having someone disrupt your routine." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something in his eyes that made my chest tight. "It's not a disruption," I said quietly. "I like having you here." The admission hung between us, heavier than it should have been. Marcus's gaze held mine for a moment too long, searching my face as if he were trying to read something written there in a language he was just beginning to understand. "I like being here," he said finally, his voice softer than usual. "More than I probably should." Before I could process what that meant, he'd turned back to the movie, but his hand had somehow found its way to my knee, resting there with a casual intimacy that sent electricity shooting through my entire nervous system. The pattern continued over the weekend. Marcus would fall asleep against my shoulder during movies, his breathing deep and even, his weight settling into me with a trust that felt both familiar and entirely new. When I tried to wake him gently, suggesting he'd be more comfortable in the bed, he'd mumble something about being fine where he was and burrow closer. Saturday night, I dozed off myself, only to wake around 2 in the morning to find Marcus's head on my chest, his arm draped across my waist, his body curled against mine on the narrow couch. The smart thing would have been to wake him, to preserve the boundaries that kept my sanity intact. Instead, I found myself running my fingers through his hair, marveling at how right it felt to hold him like this. Marcus stirred under my touch, but instead of pulling away, he pressed closer, his hand fisting in my shirt. He murmured against my chest, and the sound shot straight through me like a bolt of lightning. I lay there for another hour, wide awake, trying to memorize every detail, the weight of him against me, the way he fit perfectly in my arms, the soft sounds he made in his sleep. When I finally managed to wake him, he blinked up at me with heavy-lidded eyes and smiled. "Hey," he whispered, making no move to separate himself from me. "Hey yourself. Don't you want to sleep in the bed? Your neck's going to kill you tomorrow." Marcus considered this, his thumb tracing absent patterns on my ribs through my shirt. "Probably," he agreed, but still didn't move. "Marcus." "I know." He sighed, finally pushing himself up, but his hand lingered on my chest. "I know, Just what?" He shook his head, a flush creeping up his neck. "Nothing. Never mind." But it wasn't nothing. I could see it in the way he looked at me, in the reluctance with which he finally retreated to the bed, in the way he paused in the doorway to glance back at me settling into the couch. Sunday brought a new development. Marcus had been quieter than usual, spending most of the day on his laptop ostensibly job hunting, but I caught him watching me more than once. When I'd meet his eyes, he wouldn't look away like he used to. Instead, he'd hold my gaze with an intensity that made my skin feel too tight. "Find anything promising?" I asked, settling next to him on the couch with my own laptop. "A few leads," he said, but his attention seemed more focused on me than his screen. "Christopher, can I ask you something?" My pulse quickened. "Sure. You never bring anyone home. In all the years I've known you, I've never met anyone you were seeing." He closed his laptop, giving me his full attention. Why is that? The question hit me like a physical blow. How could I explain that every relationship I'd attempted had been doomed from the start because none of them were him? That I'd perfected the art of dating men who were safe precisely because they could never measure up to what I felt for him? "I guess I'm picky," I said weakly. "Picky how?" "I don't know. I haven't found what I'm looking for." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "What are you looking for?" The question hung between us, loaded with implications I wasn't sure I was ready to examine. "Someone who feels like home," I said finally, the truth slipping out before I could stop it. Something shifted in Marcus's expression. "Home," he repeated softly. "Yeah. What does that feel like? Home with someone." I looked at him, at the way the afternoon light caught in his hair, at the genuine curiosity in his eyes, at the way he was sitting so close I could count his eyelashes. "Like you can breathe properly for the first time," I said. "Like all the pieces of yourself that you didn't even know were scattered suddenly fit together. Like you're exactly where you're supposed to be." Marcus's breath caught, almost imperceptibly. "That sounds impossible, probably." "No," he said quickly. "It sounds perfect." The moment stretched between us, charged with something I didn't dare name. Marcus's hand moved toward mine on the couch, stopping just short of touching, and I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "Christopher," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, I think I'm figuring some things out." Before I could ask what he meant, my phone rang, shattering the moment. By the time I dealt with the call, my mother, checking in at the worst possible moment. Marcus had retreated to the kitchen, the spell broken. But something had changed. The rest of the evening was charged with an awareness that made every casual interaction feel significant. When Marcus handed me a beer, his fingers lingered against mine. When we brushed past each other in the hallway, neither of us moved away quickly. When we settled on the couch for our nightly movie, Marcus didn't even pretend to maintain distance, curling up against my side from the opening credits. "This is becoming a habit," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Is that a problem?" Marcus asked, tilting his head up to look at me. "No," I said, probably too quickly. "No, it's not a problem." "Good," he said. settling back against me, because I was planning on making it a permanent arrangement. The words sent a jolt through me. What do you mean? I mean the couch is uncomfortable as hell, and you're much better than a pillow. He was teasing, but there was something else in his voice, something that made my heart race. Marcus. Relax, he said, but his arm tightened around my waist. I'm not going anywhere. The movie played on, but I was lost in the sensation of holding him, of his steady breathing against my chest, of the way he'd started tracing lazy patterns on my arm with his fingertips. When he fell asleep this time, I didn't even consider waking him. Instead, I adjusted our position slightly, making sure he was comfortable, and let myself drift off with him in my arms. I woke around dawn to find we'd shifted during the night. Marcus was facing me now, his face inches from mine, his hand resting on my chest. His eyes were already open, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. Morning, he whispered. Morning, I whispered back, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever spell we were under. I should probably get up, he said, but made no move to do so. Probably. Look for apartments today. That would be smart. Neither of us moved. We lay there in the gray morning light, close enough that I could feel his breath against my face, close enough that if I tilted my head just slightly. Christopher, Marcus said, his voice rougher than usual. Yeah, I think I'm in trouble. Before I could ask what he meant, he pulled back, sitting up and running his hands through his hair. I should shower, he said, avoiding my eyes. Get an early start on the day. I watched him retreat to the bathroom, my heart pounding so hard I felt dizzy. The shower started, and I lay on the couch staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had just happened. The way he looked at me, the tension in his voice when he said he was in trouble, the fact that he kept finding excuses to sleep in my arms. It was all adding up to something that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. By the time Marcus emerged from the bathroom, towel wrapped around his waist, I managed to collect myself enough to start breakfast. But when he passed behind me to get to his bag, his hand briefly touched my lower back, and I nearly dropped the pan I was holding. Sorry, he said, but his voice carried that same undertone I'd been hearing all week. It's fine, I managed, though it was anything but fine. Nothing about this was fine. We were crossing lines that had kept our friendship safe for 8 years, and I had no idea how to step back from the edge we were approaching. The rest of the week followed a similar pattern. Marcus would start each day with renewed determination to find his own place, but by evening, he'd be curled up against me on the couch, his guard down, his touches more frequent and lingering. The apartment viewings he claimed to be attending never seemed to materialize into anything concrete, and I began to suspect he wasn't trying as hard as he claimed to be. Any luck today? I'd ask, and he'd shake his head, settling next to me closer than the night before. Nothing that felt right, he'd say, and I'd wonder if we were still talking about apartments. By Thursday night, Marcus had stopped even pretending to maintain his own space. He'd curl up against me from the moment we sat down, his head on my shoulder, his hand resting on my chest, his body fitting against mine like we'd been doing this for years instead of days. Marcus, I said during a quiet moment in the movie, what are we doing? He was quiet for so long I thought he'd fallen asleep. Then he tilted his head up to look at me, his eyes serious. I don't know, he said softly, but I don't want to stop. The admission hung between us, heavy with implications. I looked down at him, at the way the light from the television played across his face, at the vulnerability in his expression, and felt something shift fundamentally in my chest. I don't want to stop either, I whispered. Marcus's breath caught, and for a moment, I thought he might say something else, might finally give voice to whatever was building between us. Instead, he settled back against me, his hand finding mine and intertwining our fingers. We fell asleep like that, holding each other on the couch, both of us pretending it was still innocent even as we crossed another line in the sand. When I woke Friday morning, Marcus was watching me again, his thumb tracing patterns on the back of my hand. We should probably talk about this, he said quietly. Yeah, I agreed, though the last thing I wanted was to examine what we were doing too closely. We should, but we didn't. Instead, we went through the motions of another day, both of us aware that something fundamental had shifted, both of us too afraid to name it. The tension was becoming unbearable, every casual touch loaded with meaning, every shared glance carrying the weight of everything we weren't saying. Friday night, as we settled into our now familiar positions on the couch, Marcus was quieter than usual. He'd spent the day claiming to apartment hunt again, but I'd noticed he'd been distracted, almost nervous, all evening. "Everything okay?" I asked, running my fingers through his hair. "Christopher," he said, not lifting his head from my chest, "can I ask you something, and will you promise to be honest?" My heart started racing. "Sure. Are you happy? With your life, I mean. With how things are." The question caught me off guard. What do you mean?" "I mean, are you happy being alone? Are you happy never bringing anyone home? Are you happy with the way things have always been?" I was quiet for a long moment, trying to figure out how to answer without revealing too much. "I don't know if happy is the right word," I said finally. "I'm settled. Safe." "Safe from what?" "From getting hurt. From wanting something I can't have." Marcus shifted against me, his hand fisting in my shirt. "What if you could have it?" "Marcus, what if the thing you want, the thing that feels like home, what if it's closer than you think?" I looked down at him, at the way he was avoiding my eyes, at the tension in his shoulders, and felt the world tilt beneath me. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Marcus said, finally looking up at me, "that I haven't looked at a single apartment this week. I'm saying that I've never slept better than I have on this couch with you. I'm saying that Madison and I broke up because I couldn't stop thinking about someone else, and I'm saying that someone else is you." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at him, searching his face for any sign that he was joking, that this was some kind of mistake. But his eyes were serious, vulnerable, and completely sincere. "Marcus," I whispered. "I know," he said quickly. "I know it's complicated. I know I'm not who you thought I was, and I know I'm probably not who you pictured when you talked about finding someone who feels like home. But Christopher, being here with you, being close to you like this, it's the first time anything has ever felt completely right." I couldn't breathe. 8 years of carefully buried feelings were clawing their way to the surface, and I felt like I was drowning in the impossibility of it all. "You're not gay," I said weakly. "I don't know what I am," Marcus said. "All I know is that I'm falling for my best friend, and I don't know how to stop, and I don't know if I want to." The words hung between us like a bridge I was terrified to cross. Marcus sat there on my couch, his confession still echoing in the space around us, and I felt like the entire world had shifted on its axis. He was falling for me, his best friend, the person who had spent years carefully hiding the exact same feelings he had just laid bare. "Christopher." His voice was so soft, so uncertain. "Please say something." I opened my mouth, but no words came. How do you respond to having your deepest, most impossible wish suddenly offered to you? How do you tell someone that you've been in love with them for years when they've just discovered they might not be straight? I started, then stopped. My hands were shaking. "Marcus, I don't know what to say." Something flickered across his face, disappointment, maybe, or fear. He started to pull back, that familiar defensive posture I'd seen him use when he felt vulnerable. "It's okay," he said quickly. "I know this is weird. I know you probably don't." "No." The word came out stronger than I intended. "No, that's not." "God, Marcus, you have no idea." He went still, those brown eyes searching my face with an intensity that made my heart race. "What do you mean?" I took a shaky breath. This was it. The moment I'd imagined 1,000 times and never thought would actually come. "I mean, you're not the only one who's been falling." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stared at me like he was trying to decode a foreign language, his lips slightly parted in surprise. "You're what?" "I've been in love with you since college," I said, the words tumbling out now that the dam had broken. "Do you remember that night junior year when we stayed up until 4 in the morning talking about everything and nothing? You fell asleep on my dorm room floor, and I looked at you and realized I was completely gone. I've been hiding it ever since." Marcus's expression shifted through a dozen emotions: shock, confusion, something that might have been relief. "You've been in love with me for years?" "Years," I confirmed, my voice barely above a whisper. I thought I was getting better at hiding it, but apparently I was just getting better at lying to myself. He was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "All this time," I thought. "I mean, I knew you were gay, but I never imagined you might feel that way about me. I was so scared you'd think I was losing my mind." "You're not losing your mind," I said softly. "But Marcus, I need you to understand something. This isn't a game for me. I can't be your experiment while you figure out who you are." I can't be the person you try things with and then walk away from when you decide you're actually straight after all. The words came out harsher than I intended, but they needed to be said. I'd spent too many years protecting my heart from this exact scenario to throw caution to the wind now, no matter how desperately I wanted to. Marcus flinched like I'd slapped him. Is that what you think this is? An experiment? I don't know what this is, I admitted. 2 weeks ago, you were with Madison. You were straight, as far as I knew. And now you're telling me you're falling for me, and I want to believe it so badly it's physically painful, but I'm terrified. Of what? Of you changing your mind. Of you deciding this was just confusion or loneliness or whatever, and going back to your life while I'm left picking up the pieces of mine. Marcus was quiet for a long time, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. When he looked up at me, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. I can't promise you that I have everything figured out, he said. I can't promise you that I understand what's happening to me, or that I won't make mistakes. But I can promise you that this isn't some casual experiment. What I feel for you. It's terrifying and confusing and more real than anything I've ever experienced. My heart clenched at the raw honesty in his voice. Marcus. I know you're scared, he continued. I'm scared too. But I can't go back to pretending I don't feel this way. I can't go back to dating women and trying to convince myself that what I had with Madison was enough when I know now what it feels like to really want someone. The weight of his words settled over me like a blanket. This wasn't just about attraction or curiosity. He was talking about fundamentally changing how he saw himself, how he moved through the world. Are you sure? Because once we cross this line, there's no going back to the way things were. I don't want to go back, he said without hesitation. I want to move forward. With you. If you'll let me. I studied his face, looking for any sign of doubt or uncertainty. Instead, I found a determination that mirrored my own feelings, a quiet certainty that made my chest tight with hope. I want that too, I whispered. More than you know. Relief flooded his features, and for a moment, we just sat there looking at each other, the weight of years of unspoken feelings finally lifted. But then reality started creeping back in, bringing with it all the complications we'd have to navigate. So what now? Marcus asked, echoing my own thoughts. I don't know, I admitted. I've never done this before. I mean, I've dated, but never with someone who was figuring out their sexuality. Never with my best friend. Maybe we don't have to have all the answers right now, Marcus said tentatively. Maybe we just see what happens. The suggestion was both appealing and terrifying. Part of me wanted to take things slow, to give him time to process everything he was feeling. But another part of me, the part that had been waiting for this moment for years, wanted to close the distance between us and show him exactly how I felt. I think I'd like that, I said finally. But I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll be honest with me. If you start having doubts, if you get scared, if you need space, just tell me. Don't try to protect my feelings by hiding your own. Marcus nodded solemnly. I promise. But I need the same from you. I know you've been guarding your heart for a long time, and I understand why. But if we're going to do this, I need you to let me in. I'll try, I said, and meant it. The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence, but the air between us still crackled with tension. Everything had changed in the span of a few minutes, but we were still sitting on opposite ends of the couch, still maintaining the careful distance we'd perfected over the years. Christopher. Marcus's voice was soft, uncertain. Yeah. Can I? Would it be okay if I moved closer? My heart hammered against my ribs. Yes. He shifted across the couch slowly, like he was afraid sudden movement might shatter the fragile understanding we'd built. When he settled beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, I had to resist the urge to reach for him. This is weird, he said with a nervous laugh. Good weird, but weird. Yeah, I agreed, hyper-aware of every point where our arms almost touched. We can go as slow as you need to. Marcus turned to face me, and I was struck by how different he looked, the same features I'd memorized years ago, but softer somehow, more open. What if I don't want to go slow? The question hung between us, loaded with possibility. My mouth went dry. What do you mean? Instead of answering, Marcus reached out and touched my hand, his fingers tentative against my skin. The simple contact sent electricity shooting up my arm, and I had to bite back a gasp. I mean, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, I've been thinking about touching you for weeks now. I've been making excuses to fall asleep next to you, finding reasons to brush against you. I've been driving myself crazy wondering what it would feel like to. He trailed off, but his thumb was tracing circles on the back of my hand, and I was pretty sure I was about to spontaneously combust. Marcus, I breathed, not sure if I was warning him or encouraging him. I know this is all new for me, he continued, his eyes locked on mine. But I know what I want. I want to kiss you. I want to know what it feels like to hold you without pretending it's accidental. I want to stop being afraid of what I'm feeling. My resolve crumbled completely. Are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. The space between us seemed to shrink without either of us moving. I could feel his breath on my skin, could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. This was really happening. After all these years of dreaming and hoping and convincing myself it was impossible, Marcus was here, wanting me back. We should probably talk about this more, I said, even as I leaned closer to him. We should, he agreed, his hand coming up to cup my cheek. But right now, I really just want to kiss you. Yeah, I whispered. Me too. The first brush of his lips against mine was soft, tentative, like he was testing the waters. But when I responded, when I kissed him back with all the years of longing I'd kept bottled up, he deepened it, his other hand fisting in my shirt to pull me closer. It was everything I'd imagined and nothing like I'd expected. His lips were warm and soft, and he tasted like the coffee we'd shared earlier. But more than that, kissing Marcus felt like coming home, like finding a piece of myself I hadn't even realized was missing. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing hard, Marcus rested his forehead against mine. Wow, he said softly. Yeah, I agreed, my voice hoarse. Wow. We stayed like that for a moment, just breathing each other in, the reality of what had just happened settling over us. I'd kissed Marcus. My best friend, the person I'd been in love with for years, had just kissed me back. So, Marcus said, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. That was perfect, I finished. I was going to say better than I imagined, but perfect works too. I laughed, the sound shaky with emotion. You imagined kissing me? More than I probably should have, he admitted, his cheeks flushing pink. Especially these past few weeks. I kept wondering if you'd taste as good as you smelled when I was falling asleep next to you. He pulled in my stomach at his words. And do I? Better, he said, leaning in to kiss me again. This time, there was less hesitation, more hunger. I lost myself in the feeling of his mouth moving against mine, in the way he gasped when I nipped at his bottom lip. When his tongue traced the seam of my lips, I opened for him gladly, and the first tentative touch of his tongue against mine had me gripping his shirt like an anchor. We kissed until we were both breathless, until the couch felt too small and the space between us felt like too much. When Marcus pulled back, his lips swollen and his hair mussed from my fingers, I thought I might actually die from how beautiful he looked. I should probably go to bed, he said, though he made no move to get up. You should, I agreed, my hands still tangled in his shirt. It's getting late. It is. Neither of us moved. The tension between us was thick enough to cut with a knife, years of suppressed desire finally given permission to surface. I wanted to touch him everywhere, to map every inch of his skin with my hands and mouth. But I also knew we were in dangerous territory, that moving too fast could complicate everything we just confessed to each other. Christopher, Marcus said, his voice rough with want. Yeah, I don't think I can go back to sleeping on the couch tonight. Not after this. My heart hammered against my ribs. What are you saying? I'm saying I want to sleep next to you. In your bed. I want to fall asleep knowing I can touch you if I want to. The request was innocent enough, but the way he said it, the heat in his eyes, suggested his intentions weren't entirely pure. And honestly, mine weren't either. Marcus, I started, trying to be the voice of reason even as my body screamed at me to say yes. Are you sure that's a good idea? We just figured out how we feel about each other. Maybe we should take things slow. I'm not asking you to have sex with me, he said, though his cheeks flushed as he said it. I'm just asking to sleep beside you, to hold you, to not have to pretend anymore that I don't want to be close to you. When he put it like that, it sounded perfectly reasonable. And the truth was, I wanted it too. I wanted to know what it felt like to fall asleep in his arms without the pretense of accident or convenience. I wanted to wake up next to him and not have to hide how happy it made me. Okay, I said softly. Yeah, okay. Relief flooded his features, followed quickly by something that looked like nervous anticipation. Really? Really? But just sleeping, okay? I meant what I said about taking things slow. Just sleeping, he agreed, though the smile playing at his lips suggested he was thinking about more than sleep. We made our way to my bedroom in a haze of nervous energy and barely contained desire. I'd been in this room with Marcus before. He'd crashed here after too many drinks, or collapsed on my bed while I got ready for dates. But this felt different. This felt charged with possibility. I busied myself with mundane tasks, turning down the bed, checking that my alarm was set, while Marcus hovered near the doorway like he wasn't sure he was really allowed to be there. "You can come in," I said softly. "It's okay." He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, the soft click of the latch somehow final. There was no going back now. Whatever happened next, our friendship had already fundamentally changed. "Do you want something to sleep in?" I asked, suddenly aware that we'd never actually discussed the logistics of sharing a bed. "I usually just sleep in my boxers," Marcus said, then seemed to realize how that sounded. "I mean, if that's okay. I can put on more clothes if you want." "No," I said quickly, probably too quickly. "That's fine. I do too." We stood there for a moment, both of us apparently thinking about the implications of sharing a bed in our underwear. The air between us crackled with tension, and I had to resist the urge to cross the room and kiss him again. "I'll just—" Marcus gestured vaguely toward his pile of clothes in the corner. "Yeah, me too." We turned our backs to each other, the sudden modesty almost laughable given what we just confessed. But there was something sweet about it too, something that spoke to how new and fragile this thing between us really was. I stripped down to my boxers, hyper-aware of every sound Marcus made behind me. When I turned around, he was already under the covers, leaving space for me on my usual side of the bed. The sight of him there, his bare chest visible above the sheets, made my mouth go dry. "Are you just going to stand there?" he asked, amusement coloring his voice. "Right," I said, shaking myself out of my stupor. "Sorry." I slipped into bed beside him, and immediately regretted my decision to sleep in just boxers. The heat radiating from his body was intoxicating, and I could smell his cologne mixed with something uniquely him. It was going to be impossible to sleep. "This is nice," Marcus said softly, and I turned to find him watching me with soft eyes. "Yeah," I agreed. "It is." We lay there in the dim light filtering through my curtains, facing each other but not quite touching. The space between us felt electric, charged with everything we'd said and everything we hadn't yet done. "Christopher." Marcus's voice was barely a whisper. "Yeah, thank you." "For what?" "For being patient with me. For not running away when I told you how I felt. For letting me figure this out without making me feel like I'm crazy." My heart clenched at the vulnerability in his voice. "You're not crazy," I said firmly. "And I'm not going anywhere." He smiled, and the sight of it made my chest tight with affection. "Good. Because I'm not either." The promise hung between us as we settled into a comfortable silence. But sleep felt impossible with Marcus so close, with the knowledge that I could reach out and touch him if I wanted to. My body was hyper-aware of every breath he took, every small movement he made. "Marcus." I'm really glad you told me how you felt tonight." "Me too," he said softly. "I was so scared you'd think I was losing my mind." "I could never think that," I said. "I've been hoping for something like this for so long that I was starting to think I was the one losing my mind." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then shifted closer to me. "Can I hold you?" My heart hammered against my ribs. "Yes." He moved carefully, like he was afraid I might change my mind, until his arm was wrapped around my waist and I was pressed against his chest. The feeling of his skin against mine was intoxicating, and I had to bite back a gasp at the intimacy of it. "Is this okay?" he asked, his breath warm against my ear. "More than okay," I managed. He pulled me closer, and I let myself relax into his embrace, marveling at how right it felt to be held by him. This was what I'd been dreaming about for years, not just the physical closeness, but the emotional intimacy, the knowledge that he wanted me there. "I can't believe this is real," Marcus murmured against my hair. "It's real," I said, my hand coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "We're real." He pressed a soft kiss to the top of my head, and I thought I might melt into the mattress. "I'm falling asleep," he said softly. "Good," I said, even though I was wide awake, too keyed up from everything that had happened to even think about sleep. "Christopher." "Yeah, I love you." The words hit me like a physical blow. He'd said he was falling for me, but hearing him say he loved me was something else entirely. I love you too, I whispered back. I have for a long time. I know, he said, his voice already thick with sleep. I'm sorry it took me so long to figure it out. It's okay, I said, pressing closer to him. We have time now. We do, he agreed, his breathing already starting to even out. I lay there listening to him fall asleep, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest against my back. This was everything I'd ever wanted, Marcus in my bed, in my arms, telling me he loved me. It felt too good to be true, too perfect to last. But for now, it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Christopher woke slowly, consciousness creeping in like dawn through curtains. For a moment, he existed in that blessed space between sleep and awareness where the world felt soft and uncomplicated. Then sensation registered, warmth pressed against his back, an arm draped over his waist, breath ghosting across the nape of his neck in steady, sleeping rhythms. Marcus. His heart lurched, sending adrenaline shooting through his system as the full reality of their position hit him. This wasn't the careful distance they'd maintained the previous nights, lying side by side like strangers on a subway platform. This was intimate. This was Marcus's body curved against his, fitting together like puzzle pieces, like they'd been designed for exactly this configuration. Christopher's first instinct was to move, to carefully extract himself and retreat to the bathroom where he could splash cold water on his face and remind himself that this was accidental. That Marcus was simply a restless sleeper who'd unconsciously migrated across the bed. But as he began to shift, Marcus's arm tightened around his waist, pulling him closer with surprising strength. Don't, Marcus murmured, his voice thick with sleep but unmistakably awake. Please don't move. The words sent shockwaves through Christopher's entire nervous system. Marcus was awake. Marcus was awake and choosing to hold him, choosing to keep him close, speaking in a voice that sounded almost desperate in its quiet intensity. Marcus. Christopher's voice came out as barely a whisper, afraid that speaking any louder might shatter whatever fragile moment they'd stumbled into. I know, Marcus said, his lips so close to Christopher's neck that he could feel the movement of them forming words. I know you're awake. I know you're probably freaking out right now. I know I should let go and pretend this never happened, but I can't. I can't keep pretending anymore. Christopher's mind reeled. Pretending? What was Marcus pretending about? His body felt like it was vibrating at a frequency just below the threshold of perception, every nerve ending hyper-aware of the places where Marcus's skin touched his, the arm across his waist, the chest pressed against his back, the legs tangled with his own. I don't understand, Christopher managed, though part of him was terrified that he understood perfectly and was simply too afraid to believe it. Marcus's arm tightened again, and Christopher felt him shift closer, eliminating even the whisper of space that had existed between them. I've been lying awake for the past hour, Marcus confessed, his voice rough with something that might have been vulnerability or desire or both. Just feeling you breathe. Feeling how perfectly you fit against me. And I keep thinking about how I've never felt this safe with anyone. Not with Madison, not with anyone. The mention of Madison should have been jarring, should have reminded Christopher of all the reasons why this was impossible. Instead, it only highlighted how far they'd traveled from the night Marcus had shown up at his door, heartbroken and seeking refuge. That Marcus felt like a stranger compared to the man currently holding him like he was afraid Christopher might disappear. Marcus, Christopher started, but he wasn't sure what he was trying to say. His name just seemed to be the only word his brain could form, an anchor in the storm of sensation and emotion. I know I'm probably scaring you, Marcus continued, and Christopher could hear the fear creeping into his voice now, the uncertainty that came with stepping into uncharted territory. I know this isn't what you signed up for when you let me crash here, but I can't stop thinking about the way you look at me sometimes, like I'm something precious, like I'm worth holding on to. Christopher's breath caught. He'd thought he'd been so careful, so practiced at hiding the way his heart stuttered whenever Marcus smiled at him, the way his hands ached to reach out and touch. But apparently he'd been as transparent as glass. How long have you known? Christopher asked, his voice barely audible. Known what? Marcus's lips were so close to his ear now that Christopher could feel the warmth of his breath, could smell the familiar scent of his shampoo mixed with something deeper, something that was purely Marcus. That I? Christopher swallowed hard, the words feeling like they weighed 1,000 pounds each. That I'm in love with you. The silence that followed felt endless, stretching between them like a chasm. Christopher's heart hammered against his ribs, and he wondered if Marcus could feel it through his back, if his panic was as obvious as everything else apparently was. Then Marcus's hand moved, sliding from Christopher's waist to rest flat against his chest, directly over his racing heart. "Is that what this is?" Marcus whispered, and his voice held a note of wonder that made Christopher's throat tighten. "Love. I." Christopher started, then stopped. There was no point in lying now, no point in pretending that his feelings were casual or recent or anything other than the earth-shaking truth he'd been carrying for years. "Yes. God. Yes, Marcus. I've been in love with you since college. Since the night you fell asleep on my dorm room floor after cramming for finals, and I watched you sleep and realized I'd rather spend my life taking care of you than pursue anything else." Marcus's hand pressed harder against his chest, and Christopher felt rather than heard the sharp intake of breath. 7 years, Marcus said, and it wasn't a question. 7 years, Christopher confirmed, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff. 7 years of being your best friend and dying a little bit every time you dated someone else and pretending it didn't matter because having you in my life as a friend was better than not having you at all. Jesus, Christopher. Marcus's voice was rough, strained. 7 years of me being an idiot. You're not an idiot, Christopher said quickly, instinctively defending him even now. You're straight. You were with Madison for 3 years. You couldn't have known. But I did know, Marcus interrupted, his words coming out in a rush. Maybe not consciously, but some part of me knew. Why do you think I never brought girls around you? Why do you think I always compared every relationship to our friendship? Why do you think I ran here when everything fell apart instead of going to my parents or my brother or literally anyone else? Christopher's heart was beating so hard now he was surprised it didn't wake the neighbors. Marcus. I broke up with Madison because she said I was in love with someone else, Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength and certainty. She said I talked about you like you were the most important person in my world, and when I tried to deny it, I realized I couldn't. Because you are. You're the most important person in my world, and I've been too scared and too stupid to figure out what that meant. Christopher felt like he was floating, like gravity had suddenly become optional. What does it mean? He asked, though he was terrified of the answer, terrified that he was reading too much into this moment, into the way Marcus was holding him like he never wanted to let go. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Christopher could feel the tension in his body, the way he was gathering courage for something big. Then, slowly, carefully, Marcus began to turn Christopher in his arms, guiding him to face him in the dim light filtering through the curtains. Christopher's breath caught as he found himself looking directly into Marcus's eyes for the first time since waking up. There was something different in them. Something raw and vulnerable and determined that made Christopher's chest tight with possibility. It means, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the way his hands were shaking slightly where they rested on Christopher's shoulders, that I've been falling in love with my best friend for 7 years, and I was too afraid to admit it to myself. The words hung in the air between them, electric and transformative. Christopher stared at Marcus, searching his face for any sign that this was a dream, that he was still asleep and his subconscious was playing the cruelest trick imaginable. Say something, Marcus whispered, and the vulnerability in his voice broke Christopher's paralysis. I'm terrified, Christopher admitted, his voice shaking. I'm terrified that I'm going to wake up and this will all be in my head. I'm terrified that you'll change your mind tomorrow and things will be weird between us forever. I'm terrified that I want this so much I can barely breathe. Marcus's hands moved to cup Christopher's face, thumbs brushing across his cheekbones with devastating gentleness. I'm terrified too, he said. I'm terrified because I've never felt like this about a man before. I'm terrified because everything I thought I knew about myself is shifting. But I'm more terrified of losing you by pretending this isn't real than I am of figuring out what it means. Marcus, Christopher breathed, and this time his name felt like a prayer, like a benediction. Can I kiss you? Marcus asked, the question so quiet it was almost just breath, but it might as well have been shouted for the way it reverberated through Christopher's entire being. Christopher's answer was to close the distance between them, to press his lips to Marcus's in a kiss that was soft and desperate and years in the making. Marcus made a sound low in his throat, something between a sigh and a moan, and deepened the kiss with a hunger that spoke of his own years of unconscious longing. They kissed like they were drowning, like they were breathing life into each other, like they were trying to make up for all the time they'd lost to fear and assumptions and the weight of what they thought was impossible. Marcus's hands tangled in Christopher's hair, and Christopher's arms wound around Marcus's waist, pulling him closer until there was no space left between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Marcus rested his forehead against Christopher's, their noses touching, sharing the same air. "This changes everything," Marcus whispered, his voice full of wonder and fear and hope. "I know," Christopher replied, his hands still fisted in the fabric of Marcus's t-shirt, afraid to let go, afraid this moment might slip away if he loosened his grip. "I don't know how to do this," Marcus admitted. "I don't know how to be in love with a man. I don't know how to be in love with you without losing my mind." "We'll figure it out," Christopher said, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "We'll figure it out together. We don't have to have all the answers right now." Marcus pulled back just enough to look at him, his eyes searching Christopher's face in the dim light. "You really love me," he said, like he was testing the words, like he was trying to make them real. "I really love you," Christopher confirmed, and saying it out loud, saying it to Marcus's face while lying in his arms, felt like the most honest thing he'd ever done. "I love you too," Marcus said, and his voice broke slightly on the words. "I love you, and I'm sorry it took me so long to figure it out. I'm sorry for all the time we lost." "We're not lost anymore," Christopher said, leaning in to kiss him again, softer this time, a promise rather than a desperate confession. "We're right here. We're exactly where we're supposed to be." Marcus smiled against his lips, and Christopher felt something settle in his chest, something that had been tense and afraid for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without that weight. They spent the rest of the night talking in whispers, sharing confessions and fears and hopes, mapping the geography of this new territory they'd discovered. Marcus talked about the confusion he'd felt for months, the way he'd found himself comparing every woman to Christopher and finding them lacking. Christopher talked about the agony of loving in secret, the way he'd convinced himself that friendship was enough even when it was slowly killing him. As dawn began to creep through the windows, they were still tangled together, still talking, still marveling at the fact that they were here, that they'd found their way to each other through all the fear and confusion and years of silence. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, his fingers tracing patterns on Christopher's chest, his touch casual in a way that felt revolutionary. "Now we take it one day at a time," Christopher said, catching Marcus's hand and intertwining their fingers. "Now we figure out how to be us, but more." "More," Marcus repeated, like he was tasting the word. "I like the sound of that." Christopher kissed his forehead, breathing in the scent of his hair, still hardly believing that he was allowed to do this, that Marcus was his to hold and touch and love openly. "Get some sleep," Christopher murmured. "We have the rest of our lives to figure this out." Marcus settled against him with a contented sigh, his head on Christopher's chest, his arm draped across his waist. Within minutes, his breathing had evened out into sleep, but Christopher stayed awake a while longer, staring at the ceiling and marveling at how completely his world had shifted in the space of a single night. Everything was different now. Everything was possible. The weight of everything unsaid hung between us in the darkness, heavier than the silence that had stretched through so many nights before. I could feel Marcus's breath against my face, could see the way his eyes searched mine even in the dim light filtering through the curtains. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I was certain he could hear it, could feel it where our chests almost touched. "Chris," he whispered, and my name on his lips sounded different now, charged with something I'd dreamed of hearing but never dared hope for. "I need to tell you something." I nodded, not trusting my voice, afraid that if I spoke I might shatter whatever fragile moment we'd stumbled into. His hand was still resting on my hip from when he'd pulled me closer, and I could feel the warmth of his palm through the thin fabric of my t-shirt. "I've been lying to myself," Marcus continued, his voice barely audible. "About Madison, about why nothing ever felt right with her. About why I kept finding excuses to touch you, to be closer to you. About why the thought of finding my own place makes me feel like I'm drowning." My breath caught. This was dangerous territory, the kind of conversation that could destroy everything we'd built over 7 years of friendship. But looking into his eyes, seeing the vulnerability there, I knew we were already past the point of no return. "Marcus," I started, but he shook his head. "Please, let me finish. I need to say this before I lose my nerve." He took a shaky breath. "When Madison and I broke up, she said something that's been eating at me. She said I never looked at her the way I look at you. At first I was angry, defensive. But then I started paying attention to how I feel when I'm with you versus how I felt with her, and I realized she was right. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Every carefully constructed wall I'd built around my feelings began to crumble, brick by brick. "How do you look at me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Like you're the only person in the room," he said without hesitation. "Like you're home." The simple honesty of it broke something open in my chest. 7 years of hiding, of careful distances and swallowed words, of watching him with other people and pretending it didn't tear me apart. "Marcus, I know," he said softly. "I think I've known for a while. The way you tense up when I touch you, the way you watch me sometimes when you think I'm not looking, the way you've never brought anyone home, never talk about dating. I've been such an idiot." "You're not an idiot," I said, finally finding my voice. "You're figuring things out." "That's not the same thing." "How long?" he asked. "How long have you?" "Since college," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Since that night sophomore year when you showed up at my dorm room drunk and heartbroken over Sarah Mitchell. You fell asleep in my bed, and I lay awake all night just watching you breathe, and I knew I was in trouble." His eyes widened. "That long? That long?" I laughed, but it came out shaky. "I got very good at pretending. Had to, or I would have lost you entirely." "You never would have lost me," he said fiercely. "Never. I couldn't risk it. You were straight. You were my best friend, and I wasn't about to be the guy who ruined everything because I couldn't keep my feelings to myself." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. "I don't think I was ever really straight. I think I was just following the path that was expected of me. Dating girls because that's what I was supposed to do, trying to make relationships work that never quite fit right. And now I'm lying in bed with my best friend, and it's the most natural thing in the world. Now I understand why I've been comparing every relationship to our friendship and finding them lacking. Now I know why I spent the last 3 weeks finding excuses to get closer to you." My heart was racing so fast I felt dizzy. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I love you," he said simply. "I'm saying I've probably loved you for years and been too scared or too stubborn or too blind to see it for what it was. I'm saying that being here with you, like this, feels more right than anything I've ever done." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd imagined hearing them so many times, but the reality was overwhelming. "Marcus, I know it's complicated," he rushed on. "I know I'm still figuring things out, and I know I've put you through hell these past few weeks without meaning to. But I can't pretend anymore. I can't lie here next to you and pretend I don't want to kiss you." "Then don't," I whispered. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then Marcus moved, closing the final inches between us, and I felt his lips brush against mine, soft and hesitant and perfect. The kiss was everything I'd dreamed of, and nothing like I'd expected, gentle and questioning and full of 7 years of unspoken longing. When we broke apart, both of us were breathing hard. "Okay," he asked, his forehead resting against mine. "More than okay," I managed. He smiled, and it was like the sun coming up. "Good, because I want to do that again." "Please," I said, and this time when he kissed me, it was with more certainty, more heat. His hand tangled in my hair, and I made a sound I didn't recognize, something desperate and grateful and completely overwhelmed. We kissed until we were both breathless, until the careful distance we'd maintained for so long was completely obliterated. When we finally pulled apart, Marcus traced his thumb along my jawline, looking at me with wonder. "I can't believe we waited this long," he said. "I can't believe this is real," I replied. "It's real." He pressed another soft kiss to my lips. "I'm real, and this is real, and I love you." "I love you too," I said, the words I'd held back for so long finally free. "God, Marcus, I love you so much." We lay there in the darkness, holding each other, talking in whispers about everything and nothing. Marcus told me about the moment he'd realized his feelings, about how terrified he'd been of losing me if I didn't feel the same way. I told him about the years of watching him with other people, about the careful art of loving someone in secret. "I'm sorry," he said at one point, "for all those years of not seeing, of making you carry this alone." "You're seeing now," I said. "That's what matters." "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we figure it out," I said. "Together." He smiled at that, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. I liked the sound of that. As dawn began to creep through the curtains, we were still talking, still touching, still marveling at this new reality we'd stumbled into. The world outside would bring its own challenges, but here in this moment, wrapped in each other's arms, everything felt possible. Marcus pressed a kiss to my forehead. "No more pretending," he said. "No more pretending," I agreed. And for the first time in 7 years, I fell asleep without the familiar ache of unrequited love in my chest, replaced instead by the warm certainty of being loved in return. 3 months later, I wake up to Marcus's alarm instead of my own, and it doesn't feel strange anymore. It feels like home. He's already reaching across me to silence his phone, his chest warm against my back, and I can feel him smile when I make that half-awake sound that used to embarrass me. Now it just makes him pull me closer, press a kiss to my shoulder, and whisper, "Good morning, beautiful," like he's been doing it for years instead of months. "You know you have your own place now," I mumble into my pillow, but there's no real complaint in my voice. There hasn't been for weeks. "Yeah, but your coffee maker actually works," he says, and I can hear the grin in his voice. "And your shower has better water pressure." And his arm tightens around my waist. "And you're here." It's become our morning ritual, this lazy negotiation between sleep and waking, between his apartment and mine. In theory, Marcus moved out 6 weeks ago into a decent one-bedroom across town. In practice, his toothbrush still sits next to mine, his books are mixed in with mine on the nightstand, and his presence has soaked into every corner of my space until I can't imagine it without him. The early days after that first night were terrifying in ways I hadn't expected. Not because I doubted what had happened between us, but because I kept waiting for Marcus to panic, to decide he'd made a mistake, to retreat back into the safety of calling himself straight. Instead, he'd thrown himself into figuring out this new part of himself with the same intensity he brought to everything else. I remember the first time he said the word boyfriend out loud, testing it on his tongue like a foreign language he was determined to master. We were grocery shopping, of all mundane things, and the cashier made some comment about couples who shop together. Marcus had looked at me, taken a breath, and said, "Yeah, my boyfriend's got me eating healthier." The cashier had just smiled and kept scanning our items, but Marcus had been quiet for the rest of the trip, processing the weight of that public declaration. That night, he'd asked me about coming out, about how I'd known, about whether I was okay with him still figuring things out. I'd told him the truth, that I'd rather navigate uncertainty with him than certainty with anyone else. That seemed to settle something in him, and since then, he's approached loving me with the same confidence he approaches everything else that matters to him. The hardest part wasn't Marcus's adjustment, it was learning to trust that this was real. 7 years of unrequited love don't just disappear because the other person finally loves you back. For weeks, I kept waiting for him to realize he'd made a mistake, kept looking for signs that he was forcing himself to feel something that wasn't there. It took Marcus getting frustrated with my careful distance to finally break through my fear. "You're still protecting yourself from me," he'd said one night when I'd hesitated before reaching for his hand. "I need you to believe this is real, because I can't prove it to you every single day. I can just love you every single day." He was right. I'd been so used to hiding my feelings, to managing the ache of wanting someone I couldn't have, that I'd forgotten how to just want freely. Learning to trust that Marcus's "I love you" meant the same thing as mine took time, but he was patient with my uncertainty the same way I was patient with his discovery. Now, 3 months later, we found our rhythm. Marcus still gets that slightly amazed look sometimes when he watches me move around the apartment, like he can't quite believe he gets to be here, gets to want this. I still get overwhelmed sometimes by the simple fact that I can kiss him whenever I want, that I can say, "I love you," without it being a secret I have to swallow. Our old couch has become something different now, not a careful negotiation of space and boundaries, but a place where we naturally gravitate toward each other. Last night, we'd curled up to watch a movie, Marcus's head on my chest, my fingers in his hair, and I'd realized that this was what I'd been imagining all those years. Not the dramatic confessions or the desperate kisses, but this, the quiet comfort of loving someone who loves you back. I should probably go to my actual apartment at some point, Marcus says now, but he's already settling back against me, clearly in no hurry to leave. My neighbors are going to think I died. "We could get your mail later," I suggest, turning in his arms so I can see his face. 3 months, and I still get a little breathless at the way he looks at me, like I'm something precious he gets to keep. Later, he agrees, and kisses me like we have all the time in the world. Because we do. We're not desperate anymore, not careful, not pretending. We're just us, Christopher and Marcus, best friends who became something more not because we forced it, but because we finally stopped being afraid of it. The morning light filters through the curtains, casting everything in gold, and I think about that first night when Marcus showed up at my door with just a duffel bag and nowhere else to go. Neither of us could have predicted we'd end up here, wrapped around each other in the bed we no longer pretend to share out of necessity. I love you, I tell him, because I can, because it's true, because 7 years of silence make every declaration feel like a gift. I love you too, he says back, and means it completely. And for the first time in my life, love feels simple.